Good to know. All right, so that's a play on word. The title of this talk, "Shrubs Are Cool Too," because I won't say very much about this, but I do have a YouTube series called "Plants Are Cool Too" that you can check out. We've been making mini documentaries about cool plants and the cool people who study them since 2011. So check that out if you will. And there even are a few episodes about shrubs. Next, please. I also want to say that spring is coming. This is from 2 days ago here at Bucknell. Winter aconite just coming up through the ground, and I have a feeling that by tomorrow we'll see flowers as well. So this is a harbinger of spring on its way. Next, please. So here at Bucknell, I want to just acknowledge that I'm really lucky to work with a really fine group of folks, including an incoming postdoc named Devaney Jolman, whose work I will reference toward the back end of this talk. But I also want to give a good fist pump to student Rebecca, who is like me, a native of New Jersey. Next. At our institution, we are a primarily undergraduate institution, so lots of undergrads in this liberal arts environment. And it's my job pretty much every day to try to get them excited about plants, right? To sort of generate a little bit of enthusiasm for plants. I know I'm not going to turn every student here into a botanist, but I want them to walk out of here with an appreciation for botany, right? And for the green things around us. Next. I myself, became a botanist in New Jersey, right? I grew up in Bergen County. I'm from Park Ridge. My mother, big time gardener. Her father, my grandfather, big time gardener. I can remember him layering azaleas in the backyard and putting the branches in jars. And I learned a little bit about plant propagation even as a kid. And so I sort of always had this appreciation for plants, and it really began to grow for me in New Jersey. Next. But I'd say I probably became a botanist with a capital B when I was an undergraduate at Rutgers. I attended Cook College at Rutgers University, and I spent about a decade on that campus between being an undergrad and a master's student and doing some part-time instruction. And so I really was there sort of throughout the 1990s. And if any of you know the history of botany at Rutgers, you may know the name David Fairbrothers, and he was a plant systematist. He studied the relationships of plants and their biodiversity. And he retired from Rutgers in right at the end of the 1980s and wasn't replaced until the beginning of the 2000s. So for a decade, there wasn't a ton of botany in the curriculum, and that happened to be the decade that I was there. But I was really lucky. Next, please. And that's because a lot of other folks sort of picked up and taught at least plant-related coursework that was awesome for a kid like me who just had this sort of sort of interest in plants, and they sort of helped keep that going. For me, the biggest watershed course for me as an undergraduate was dendrology. This was this sort of ID in biology of woody plants, and here we are today talking about woody plants. John Kuzer always taught that course at Rutgers, but he was on sabbatical when it came up for me, and I feel very fortunate that Don Konezik from Pinelands Nursery stepped in and taught that course the semester that I took it. I learned a ton and really sort of learned to love plants in that way. When I registered for the class in the spring before it was offered, it was a fall course. I decided I was just going to go ahead and try to learn as many trees as I could that summer so I'd be ready for the class. And I don't know how many of you out there are sort of my age or older, but maybe you had the same experience that when you reached for a book to learn about nature, it was one of these awesome golden guides, right? In my house, the bookshelves had golden guides on them. You wanted to go to a pond, you picked up the golden guide to pond life, right? Because it was the best book you could find to do that. And I grabbed this golden guide to trees, and I spent that entire summer walking around, making sure I knew all the trees and making sure I memorized all their Latin names. And when I showed up that fall, I was really prepared. It was the first class I ever truly aced. In fact, on the field portion, I only had a half point off the entire semester, and I still remember today exactly where I lost that half point. Someday I'll get it back from Don, I think. Next, please. All right. So I also took a number of courses with Roger Lacandro at Rutgers that were really field-based. His field ecology course was really an examination of the natural communities of New Jersey. I learned so much about that special state. And then I did two field experiences with him, one in Newfoundland and one in Alaska. And I just really learned to love field biology and really learned to love learning about real things in real places, which is just the kind of teaching I try to bring every day to my students. Next. And as a senior, I decided I was going to take on an honors project under the guidance of John Kuzer and Barbara Goff. And that project was really ambitious. It was I was going to essentially write a field guide to the trees of New Jersey. Next, please. And so the gist here was that, I had taken the dendrology course and I had TA'd it a couple of times, and I had a really good sense for the different resources that I and students were using in that class. And one of them was this Austin Lentz guide that you see here, the 1963 publication from Rutgers Extension. With great illustrations by Alien Hanses. I'm imagining that a number of you have seen it or have it, right? This is one of those things that was like really coveted. There weren't a ton of copies around. The people who had this book were like really lucky, and we used to borrow it from each other and check it out. And so my idea was that as an undergraduate senior, that I was going to, in one academic year, sort of essentially use those illustrations to make a new comprehensive pocket-sized field guide to the trees of New Jersey. So write all new content, use the illustrations, add new species. My wife, Rachel, is an artist and illustrator, and she would do the additional species that we would need to sort of make it a bit more comprehensive. I did not finish that in my 1 year of college as an honors project, but I got really lucky. I got a seasonal position that summer with the Forest Resource Education Center down in Jackson, with the New Jersey Forest Service, and they let me take this on as a project as part of my job. And we put together this guide. So that has now been revised and reprinted 7 times. There's been 7 different editions, the most recent one being in 2017. And that to me showed that there was a demand for this kind of publication, right? Clearly, we weren't printing millions of copies, but we were running out of print runs over and over again, needing to revise, which was nice to be able to revise it as it went along and then get it printed up again. And we're now in that 7th printing. Part of maybe some of those increased sales were that it got adopted by the dendrology course at Rutgers. And the reason I know exactly what year is because I was teaching the course when we adopted it. Next, please. So I did get to do some teaching after I finished my bachelor's, and that included when John Kuzer went on his next sabbatical. I then stepped in the same role that Don Knezegut had previously, taught that whole course, and a handful, a few other courses as well. So I got a really good sense from taking Dendro, from TAing it, from teaching it, from teaching a few other courses of what the resources were available to students who wanted to learn about this stuff, but also to learn from resource professionals what were the things that they were using in New Jersey in particular. So I re-enrolled as a master's student. Next. And I was there for a couple of years, took another few sort of plant-related courses. I just want to mention that this one, Medicinal Plants of New Jersey, with Cecil Still. Some of you will know this name, maybe knew him. I think this was the last time that Dr. Still taught this course. He comes from a family with a deep and an impressive history and legacy of botany in the Pine Barrens, particularly medicinal plants. And so the opportunity to sit in a room and listen to him for an entire semester and sort of just take it all in, right? It's absolutely encyclopedic knowledge of native plants in New Jersey and in particular medicinal plants. That was an amazing thing. But I also had to do a thesis. Next. And that thesis was advised by John Kuzer, right? But also the late Joan Ehrenfeld and Peter Smouse. Next. So the idea here was that what we needed was a companion to the tree guide, right? And so one thing that was certain and that was made clear to me is that there were a lot of books about trees out in the world, but myself, when I was a student in dendrology, and then the students that I had often pointed to the fact that they really didn't have one single good resource for shrubs, right? And you could get this Graves book that had really good treatments of shrubs. A lot of us used it, but it was from 1956. You could get that Simon's shrub identification book, which you can still find in bookstores all over the place. Incredible photographs, like really nice stuff, but not a ton of background information about individual species. And if you were really lucky, you could find that Shoemaker book from 1965, which was specifically about shrubs and woody vines in New Jersey, but also not a ton of individual information, species by species. Obviously, there were a lot of other things you could grab, Peterson's Guide to Trees and Shrubs, et cetera. And so what I was seeing is that students were sort of piecemeal putting together resources that they could use to learn about shrubs that they would have to know for this course. And so the idea was to do this as a master's thesis. Next. So we did. So that became my thesis project. And again, and this time in a much more sort of impactful and impressive way, Rachel did all the illustrations. So we published this one also through the Forest Resource Education Center, treated about 200 species total, and Rachel did 92 illustrations for this guide. So this was a real labor of love for us, right? We spent 2 years on this. In the promo bio, it talked about how we lived in an apartment in New Jersey, and there were plants all over the place. She had her drawing table, and then I had plants everywhere else, right, including the refrigerator. And that's what we worked on for 2 years on this project together. And it took on a really similar format to the tree guide. They're very similar in nature. Next. Every treatment includes the normal things that you would expect, right? Habitat, range, characteristics of the species. But we wanted to sort of include the numerous different common names that people might use for a given species, and even sometimes any Latin names that are sort of synonyms for the one that is most accepted. Lots of natural history notes, and for certain species, a lot of treatment about sort of what we would say are similar species. So to the one that's sort of at the top in the highlighted species, what are the things that you might mistake it for, or what are some close relatives that you might also run into in the landscape in New Jersey? And again, in all of these treatments, it was really about like, where do these things grow in New Jersey? Where are you most likely to find them? But for me, I also wanted to have a lot of the natural history stuff that I was always teaching when I taught those species. And so a lot of that is embedded in there. Next. So we have now published 3 editions of that. So initial one was 2002. The most recent one came out a year ago, this past December. Rachel also works here at Bucknell, so it was really nice that they put out a press release and a news story about us doing this together. Again, talking about how we basically have been working on this thing for more than 20 years, and to have it come out again, a fully revised new version, was really exciting for both of us. I do have to mention that the only reason this 3rd edition even came out was that Christine Junksa at the FREC did a ton of work to get it done. She actually had to relay out the entire publication in order to get it reprinted this time around. So I really appreciate all that work that she did. All right, next, please. So in all of this, what has happened is that, I've spent 20 years really getting to know the shrubs of the region, right? I'm only one state away now in Pennsylvania. And so I've spent a ton of time out in the field admiring shrubs, thinking about shrubs, teaching students about shrubs. And I've taken a ton of photos that, a lot of them I get to share with you today. And I think what I'll do sort of from here on out is, really sort of look at some of my favorite shrubs and tell a few stories in a series of shrub spotlights. This is one of those times where I said I can't see or hear you, but I can feel the eyes rolling appropriately. Next, please. So let's start with these, right? Why not, right? Let's start with exotic invasive shrubs, right? Now, a lot of you folks recognize these things there. On the left, we've got burning bush, Euonymus alatus. We've then got Rhamnus cathartica, the common buckthorn. There's a privet there, right? One of the ligustrum species, and then our old pal, autumn olive, Elaeagnus umbellata. I think when you talk to people and say, well, what shrubs and bushes do you know, right? What are things that you see in the field? Very often people will sort of mention some of the exotic stuff, and particularly the exotic invasive stuff. They're simply all over the place. In a functional sense, they own a lot of understories, right? And that's worth noting, right? That people are familiar with these species. But I'm also starting with these because of something that was mentioned earlier by Bobby. Next. We should be celebrating this awesomeness, right? That New Jersey has caught up to a lot of other states and now has this law, right? Thank you to everyone on this Zoom that was involved in this. I can't imagine how much work it must have been to finally get to this point. And I'm showing that same graphic that Bobby showed. But in this particular case, I am highlighting the shrubs. So of these things that are now on the current prohibited species list, 12 of them are shrubs, including the 4 friends we just talked about on the previous slide. So I want to talk about a few of these, some things that are here, and then a few things that are not, right? Next, please. So let's start with the honeysuckle, right? The bush honeysuckle. So what is listed is the Amur honeysuckle, Lonicera mackii, and also Maro's honeysuckle, Lonicera marrowii. Good. I'm glad they're there, right? We should not be planting these things, and we should be trying to eradicate them where they are. What's not on there, notably, are a couple of other things that are definitely out there on the landscape, probably on the watch list of that committee, right? So Taterica, the Tatarian honeysuckle, and then this interesting thing that I wonder how many of you are seeing, which is the hybrid between Taterica and Marrowii, Lonicera x Bella. It's actually not a hard one to identify because it most frequently has these really nice pink flowers that you see here in the image. Next, please. And so I'm going to show for some of these species the iNaturalist mapping. And if you're not familiar with iNaturalist, it's sort of this platform where people can upload photos as records of species that they're seeing on the landscape, not just plants, all organisms. And those records then get vetted by the community, right? So really sort of the number of people who sort of also agree that you have the correct identification strengthens that record, right? And it's kind of a cool way to see in real time what people are seeing on the landscape. This is the records that people are seeing for this Lonicera X Bella in New Jersey. I will say that the top one is probably not it, right? The flowers don't really match. So this is a good caveat for the kind of data that we're seeing here. But I'm going to show some of these because I still think they're a really good indication of what's out there and how much of it is being reported. Next. What's also not on that list, right, and maybe ends up being things we want to sort of look out for are these two species. So one is the winter honeysuckle, Fragrantissima. This is an interesting one, larger, showier flowers, blooms like late winter, very early spring. So it's different from the other honeysuckles, and perhaps that's why people can recognize it and identify it. The European fly honeysuckles, Xylostium is another one that's out there here and there, but hard to tell apart from these others, right? Some of these bush honeysuckles are actually really difficult to identify when you're out in the field. So I think it's probably just a good practice to decide that we're not going to be planting them, of course, but also trying to get them out of habitats when we can. Of course, there are a couple of native bush honeysuckles, Dioica and Canadensis, and again, to some degree, it's not always the easiest thing to tell all of these apart. What I would say is that if you're really dead set on wanting to have a bush honeysuckle in your yard or landscaping, I'd choose this next thing. Next, please. Gosh, I sure do love deer villa, the so-called bush honeysuckle. This is such a great native species. It doesn't make fleshy fruits like those other ones in the genus Lonicera, but it has these really lovely flowers. It doesn't achieve the same stature. It's more of a 2 to 3 foot tall thing. And once you sort of put it in place, it's going to spread and form like a little colony, although it does respond really well to being cut back. This is one in our backyard, and it's really one of my most favorite native plants. Drought tolerant, pretty decent in poor soils, and just lovely when it blooms. Next, please. Uh, Also on the list of banned plants is the common privet, Ligustrum vulgare. You can see the iNaturalist records there. And that's good that it's on this list, right? This is sort of one of those classic hedge privets that is problematic. What I find is that a lot of folks will identify any privet to this species, but there's a couple of others out there that have also been suggested as being pretty problematic. The one that I see everywhere, much more than common privet, is Ligustrum obtusifolium, the border privet. That's the photo we see here. Out here in Pennsylvania, it is like the one I see all the time. Ligustrum sinense, the Chinese privet, has also shown up in the literature as being pretty problematic as well. So these, all three of them, are kind of out there. They're often difficult to tell apart. Also, when you get into the keys, it comes down to like how far the anthers stick out of the flowers and how much hair is on the developing ovaries and the immature fruits, right? There's some tough stuff there, but in general, there are no native ligustrums in New Jersey, so you can be a safe bet that anyone that you see is a problem and shouldn't be planted, but also should be eradicated. All right, next, please. I was so happy to see this one pop up on that list, right? This is Rhodotypos scandens. This is one of those that was a sort of classic landscape plant, like from decades previous, that most folks don't tend to buy and plant today, but it's out there, right? It was not common for a long time as a naturalized or escape plant. Mary Huff's awesome book, New Jersey Wild Plants, in 1983 said it was spreading locally in a single Hunterdon County site, but that was destroyed, and then one site in Mercer County, recorded in 1936, and nowhere else, right? Had it been recorded before. And now it's considered an invasive. Next, please. And there is why, right? The iNaturalist records, and this is one that's really not hard to mistake for anything else. It's clearly all over New Jersey. So I was pleasantly surprised to see this make that list. This is in the rose family. It's one that I'm seeing increasingly out here in Pennsylvania as well. I recall in the early 2000s finding this in a big patch in Connecticut when I was a PhD student and making a bunch of herbarium collections, bringing them to the late Les Merhoff at the herbarium, and him trying to convince me that these were planted, that they were not naturalized. He just hadn't seen it sort of becoming a problem like that. And that's only 25-ish years ago. And now it's on a list as one of our worst invasives. So interesting how quickly that one is taken off. Next, please. Here's another one that's really taken off. This is me on my mother's porch, back deck in North Jersey in Bergen County last summer. This is the Japanese angelica tree, or Aralia elata. Also makes the list, and I'm so glad to see that. This is one that has like kind of slowly exploded, if that's such a thing. I remember hearing reports that it had jumped out of cultivation at the New York Botanical Garden, and then all of a sudden it was popping up all over the place. The site I found at here in Bergen County was inundated with the stuff, and it's like an impressive beast, right? I'm holding in my hand a section of the plant with only 3 leaves. Each of those leaves is one single compound leaf, and then you see the size of the inflorescence, the flowering structure, those big prickles all over it. So this is a little bit of a monster thing when it gets going. But I was glad to see it listed, and there's good reason for it. Next. Because in 1983, Huff didn't even include it in her book as a thing that was anywhere in New Jersey. Next. But today, even just for iNaturalist records, we're seeing there are some really high density areas where this is popping up. And if we were to include New York, we'd see it all over New York City and Long Island and some other parts around there as well. Next. There is, of course, what we might consider a native Aralia, a couple of others, but one that is similar to this, the devil's walking stick, Aralia spinosa. Maybe native in southern New Jersey, right? But certainly spreading and something you can find around the state. One of the ways to tell these apart is that spinosa is not fuzzy, not tomentose, but the Japanese angelica tree is. Next. It was interesting to see this one viburnum on that list, Viburnum sieboldii, really popular landscape viburnum. You can see it's got distributions in the state. But one that is not, right? And again, I know this is a starting point, right? I had to be so much work just to get those species onto that list, right? But one that certainly should be considered for also being added is this one, Linden viburnum, Viburnum dilatatum. Look at those records, especially that density there in sort of north central New Jersey. I'm seeing that popping up all over the place in Pennsylvania as well. Neither one of these species, Sieboldii, just go back one, please, Mike, or dilatatum, are listed in Huff's book in '83. So she doesn't even have them as something that you might see in a natural situation in the early '80s. But the two of them are all over the place now. Next. And, we might as well not deal with these non-native viburnums at all, right? If we're thinking about native plants, there's so many awesome options, right? These are all the native viburnums in New Jersey. They include things like the upper left, nannyberry, Viburnum nudum. The lower left is our native cranberry bush viburnum. There's also the European. And then there's the blue-fruited arrowwood viburnum. That's probably Viburnum dentatum. And then on the bottom right is blackhaw Viburnum prunifolium, all beautiful things. I love the one on the top right, although it's not very common in cultivation, but that is Viburnum lanthanoides, the linden viburnum. That is, even just for the fact that it's got those hobblebush is the common name most people use. Even if just for those naked buds, they're so cool. That's what those buds look like all winter long. That's a reason to have that thing around. Plus, it's got some pretty neat fall color. Next, please. So, that leads me to, thinking about native, right? What does it really mean for a plant to be native? And I know I'm a diehard listener of the Wild Story podcast, and I know that this comes up all the time, right? As a question about what do we really mean when we say native? And when we want to plant native plants, what's our sort of geography of that, right? Are we talking about the continent, like this Armitage book, right? Are we talking about the country, the region, the state? Are we talking about counties, right? And I think often we're thinking, okay, this thing is native in, say, Cape May County, but not native in Sussex County, right? And that's worth thinking about. Okay. Next. Um, and there's also this question that comes up all the time on the wild story about whether, sorry, one step back, please. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Go ahead next. It's hard to not have my own fingers on the buttons. I hear people talking about certain plants as native plants that are great for the garden, but it depends where you are, right? In New Jersey, technically, right, the Carolina allspice, Calycanthus floridas, is not native, right? Same for Fothergilla. Both these are great plants. These are both in my garden, right? Our gardens out here in Pennsylvania. Love Fothergilla, great fall color, awesome flowers, but not technically native in New Jersey, nor Pennsylvania. Next. There's also the big question I hear all the time, which is, are cultivars of native plants really native, right? If we're talking about a native landscape, is that what we want to put out there, right? I happen to love a few of these things, right? These are also from our house. Two of these are, right? I love that little Henry cultivar of Sweet Spire, Itea virginica. Great fall color. There's always pollinators all over it. I'm super into this black chokeberry Viking variety because of the how big those fruits are. Right? They're never. I can't say those fruits are ever delicious on a black choke berry, but I do eat them. I like them, and they're often called a superfood. And I am currently coveting this low scape mound cultivar of black choke berry that I've seen used in a few places, bank stabilizations and other sort of ground cover kind of situations, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful plant. So are these native? I tend to lean towards they are, right? But it's sometimes up to folks to sort of have their own definition. Next. But really, right, in the end, getting any kind of native plants out there in your landscape or into restoration areas like this one here is good for local ecology, right? And that includes being good for interactions with other organisms and including things like pollinators. There's lots of shrubs that are great for pollinator. For me, the absolute gold standards, the buttonbush, Cephalanthus occidentalis. I love this thing. When I run into it in swamps and wetlands, I'm always very excited, and I love seeing it in the cultivated landscape. This is in a restoration area near our house. And so I'm always out there looking at what's on these flowers. And you can see from left to right, we get bees, we get wasps and hornets, we get beetles, we get hoverflies, we get butterflies and moths. Like this thing is just an absolute magnet, right? So this is one of the things that's, obviously a really popular kind of pollinator shrub. Next. But there are also some underdogs, right? We may not think of Hamamelis virginiana, the witch hazel, as being necessarily a pollinator shrub for the landscape, but it serves a particular community of pollinators we might not think about very much. This is a great paper from about 20 years ago by my PhD advisor Greg Anderson and his colleague Jim Hill, looking at the pollinator visitations on witch hazel. And many of you know this is like a late fall, early winter bloomer. What is even out there to pollinate these flowers? And they found that 73% of all the visits were flies, right? Things in the order Diptera. And almost half of those flies were these really interesting little things called dark winged fungus gnats. When I see lists of like pollinator plants and pollinators people want to attract, I never see the old dark winged fungus gnat on those lists because we don't think about those sorts of things typically, right? But this is something that functionally is serving a pretty particular purpose. So another great example for me of an underdog pollinator shrub. Next. Of course, there's other insects that are going to use our plants, and I think that often folks with gardens and landscaping are not thinking about wanting caterpillars on their plants. But I spent a lot of time talking to and learning from Dave Wagner, who's a professor at University of Connecticut when I was a student there, and this is one of my favorite field guides of all time. If you haven't looked at this thing, it is amazing. It indexes caterpillars by their host plants. You can look at host plants to see which caterpillars you might find on those plants. And I use this resource as well as Dave himself to include a lot of a lot of caterpillar host plant information in our shrub guide as well. And so, you can attract all sorts of interesting things, right? This past summer, this is a twin spotted sphinx caterpillar on a willow in our front yard. And then these are some dogwood sawfly larvae on one of our dogwoods. This is not a caterpillar. It's the larvae of a fly, right? And I have to admit that I knocked these off the plant. They were actually devouring one of our shrubs. But I've also read quite a bit saying that this can be a really important food source for insectivorous birds. Next. One of the other plants that I keep around in the yard is one that's also not typically cultivated, but the spice bush, Lindera benzoin. I happen to really love this one, even for the fact that I'm hoping to someday have spice bush swallowtail caterpillars, snake mimics, on the this plant. But in the meantime, they haven't shown up yet. In the meantime, it's got great fall color. These fruits are devoured by birds. As soon as they ripen, they're gone. And I'm kind of a sucker for early spring flowers. This is one of the earliest bloomers in the spring. They're not super showy, but when they pop up, they're one of the few things out there to enjoy. Next. And there's all sorts of literature saying that when you plant native woody plants, shrubs, and also trees, that's a really good thing for not just caterpillars, but also the for insectivorous birds that rely on some of those larval insect resources, right? And so many of you, I'm sure, have read or seen Doug Tallamy speak. He's done a bunch of really cool work with folks like Desiree Narango and a few other people looking at and sort of promoting this idea, right? That planting native trees, planting native shrubs leads to more native caterpillars, and that leads to more native songbirds, right? And this is a graphic from a paper from 2017 that I just really love. So let's break this down for a minute. Along that y-axis on the left, we've got essentially foraging preference, and these are chickadees that live in yards in the Washington, D.C. area that are insectivorous birds. And so that is a way of tracking sort of, their preference on sort of being on and around plants that have caterpillars, that might have caterpillars on them. And then on the x-axis along the bottom, we have this thing that they call the Lepidoptera index. This is like caterpillars of butterflies and moths, right? And it's essentially a way of saying how many different species of caterpillars are showing up on a given group of plants. So along the bottom, we have the non-native Zelkova sitting there at 0 native caterpillars. We have Fagus, the beech, at 127, and then there's Acer, the maples, Betula, the birches, and then Quercus out there on the end are the oaks. And the solid line tells us that native species in each of these groups are have a strong correlation, right? When you plant those species, you get more native caterpillars, and that's our Lepidoptera index, and that then drives more presence and preference of native insectivorous birds. What's fascinating about this is also the dotted line, right? So even if you have shrubs and trees in the same groups, but they're exotic species, non-native, you do see some increase, right, in the presence of insectivorous birds and their preference for eating caterpillars, but it remains really low, right? The key point being that when you have native plants for caterpillars to eat, you get lots of native birds, and you're supporting native bird populations at that same time. So I just love this. It shows that relationship so clearly. Next, please. So when I talked to Dave Wagner, the author of this fine book, The Caterpillar's Field Guide, that I love so much, we were working on our shrub guide, and I said, Dave, what do you think is the best native shrub in New Jersey in terms of supporting caterpillar populations, and thus, by proxy, would then support native bird populations? And I'll give you a second to think about this a little bit. All right. I gave him sort of a list. We talked about the book, and here's what he said. Next. It's this one, scrub oak, Quercus ilicifolia, right? This true underdog of the pine barrens in the coastal plain and some of the ridge tops up in the northwestern part of the state. This is the #1 caterpillar shrub in all of New Jersey. There's that's a pull quote from that section right there. That's more or less from Dave's brain. Fantastically rich caterpillar fauna, more than 200 species eat its leaves. 200 different species of caterpillars eat scrub oak. So if you have that on the landscape, you're supporting a huge diversity of these caterpillars, which then in turn is supporting as a food resource lots of birds. Not many folks grow this as a garden plant, but I've got one in the yards only because Dave told me this, and I want to see as many caterpillars on that thing as I can. Next, please. So, there's a pretty clear relationship between, having native shrubs on your landscape and then supporting wildlife in different ways. When you have lots of diversity in native shrubs, you also tend to have diversity in wildlife. Lots of papers show that. But one I want to point out, of course, is this great classic paper from Hutchison Memorial Forest in right there in New Jersey. And one of the things this talks about is old field colonization. When you have old farm fields that, essentially, like if the idea is for for a farm field to eventually become a forest? What are the steps that are required? And one of the key things is that when shrubs begin to colonize an old field, they become perching sites for birds. So they're bringing in seeds in their feces that they've eaten in fleshy fruits. And then you begin to get cover for mammals that are bringing in heavier fruits, including things like nuts. And you begin to sort of bring in these propagules, and that then starts the sort of recruitment of your trees, and then you get a forest from that, right? When the shrubs show up, eventually the forest recovers and returns. The opposite is true when the shrubs don't show up. So this is a paper on the right that I published with a couple of students a few years ago, looking at riparian woodlands along the Susquehanna River. These are woodlands that are mostly completely invaded with Japanese knotweed. When that knotweed is present, it basically freezes recruitment of any other kinds of plants, right? So you don't get that initial colonization of an understory consisting largely of shrubs, and then that eventual colonization of trees. We have some really sad riparian forests around here where the canopy is native trees, right? Old trees, 60, 70-foot tall trees. And then there's a gap between that. You know, if you're in the forest, there's this big gap where you've got nothing until about 6 feet. And there's the knotweed, and then it dominates the entire understory. So when that is happening, you just don't get recruitment of a new forest. So shrubs are a really important element of that. In these systems as well, where the knotweed is dominant, insect diversity crashes, and then songbird diversity does the same. These are silent forests. They can be really sad places. Next, please. And of course, when birds are around, it's awesome. So a lot of us will plant plants with fleshy fruits because we want to sustain and support bird populations. One of my favorites, and I'm sure for a lot of folks, is the winterberry holly, Ilex verticillata. The hollies are often talked about as producing low quality fruits. So they're not taken early. These things ripen in the fall, and birds mostly ignore them until late winter or even early spring. They're not super nutritious, right? They kind of just hang out. They're not the preferred food in the fall when those fall migrating birds are moving through. But it's really interesting to watch what happens in the winter, right? 2 years ago, in 2024, the winterberry shrubs in our yard were fully fruited until mid-March, right? When like robins started getting a lot more active, catbirds started getting, mockingbirds started getting, we started to have like a lot of these returning frugivores that we hadn't seen much throughout the winter. They came in, they kind of just took them because they were still there. This year, right? Frigid temperatures in early February, lots of snow cover. Our shrubs were entirely stripped by February 5th. So it's really interesting to see that, right? Low quality, but when they are what available, they will eat them. And in the meantime, they just look beautiful. Next. And of course, there's lots of others that have higher quality fruits that birds love, right? So the one of the great examples are our native shrub dogwoods. Two of my favorites being Cornus racemosa, the gray twig dogwood, and Cornus amomum, the silky dogwood. My fall migrating birds are coming through, and they're picking these things off as they ripen, right? Pretty easy to tell these two apart, right? Cornus racemosa has these upright raceme-like fruiting stems, bright red. Look at the way they shine in the sun, and white fruits. Cornus amomum is more of an open kind of umbel, like an umbrella kind of shape with blue fruits. So pretty distinct differences in these two. But I do want to point to something. Next, please. A heads up. There's this really interesting species called rough-leaved dogwood, Cornus drummondii. This is a native species in the U.S., but in the Midwest and the Great Plains, excuse me. I'm pointing this out to you because I was part of a restoration project about 10 years ago where we ordered gray twig dogwood, Cornus racemosa. And we planted out a whole thing. We now have this like really dense, like beautiful understory restoration project that is all Cornus drummondii, right? So we were provided with material, rooted cuttings that we were told was gray twig dogwood. And I think because this is also white fruited, somebody made a mistake along the way. And so now we have this huge patch in this restoration site of this species, technically not native here. And I think that's probably happened in other places. So keep an eye out for this one, another white fruited species. It's cool. This is actually one in my yard, right? It's a neat plant, but I have a feeling it's getting mixed up with gray twig dogwood here and there. Next, please. Another heads up is that there is some new nomenclature surrounding the dogwoods. And I say new, even though this is something that came through scientifically about 10 years ago. And these names actually reflect publications that were out in the late 1700s or early 1800s. So they're actually really old names. They just haven't been adopted by most folks. There's been a real push in the taxonomy community to begin to use different genus names for basically all of the dogwoods. So if you read the scientific literature, you will find that the shrub dogwoods are now, instead of cornus, they are swida. The large bracted ones, like flowering dogwood that you see here with the red fruits, instead of cornus, those are now benthamidia. And then, of course, the small ones have the biggest name. The bunchberries are now Chame periclyminum. Say that one 10 times real fast. The only thing left, like that is typically found in our landscape, is the cornelian cherry dogwood. The only thing left in Cornus is that. So Cornus moss, there's 5 other species still left in the genus Cornus, but the only one that we see very much of is this one. But here's what I'll say. Next, please. Here's an example of what happens when you get name changes that people don't like. So a couple of years ago, I was working on the revision of the shrub guide. I posted this on Facebook saying one of the name changes that we were adopting was we were moving our shrubby dogwoods from Cornus to Swida. I showed us crossing it out and putting Swida there. And the response was crazy, right? Please no. Woke up and chose violence, did you? First, you science people took Pluto, now this. Taxonomists are terrorists, right? And then here, remember, this is a legitimate name, but not the only one. It is being foisted on us by splitters, and it is not necessary to accept it. And that's the truth. People were not happy about this, even though it's a decade into like the science saying that these are actually now separate genera. I have to admit, I totally backed down on this one. I kept them in this third edition. They're all still Cornus. I couldn't believe the response, and I figured maybe this wasn't the time to go ahead and make that change in our book, right? For you, the purposes of like for utility, right? People know these still as Cornus, and for the field guide, I think that was okay. I listed the other names as synonyms in the treatments, but pretty funny, right? People don't love change, obviously, and sometimes when you've been using a name for a long time, for decades, people don't love when that shifts. Next, please. So I also, of course, love a lot of other things, right? Gooseberries, currants, good for me to eat, good for birds to eat. Next. Who doesn't love Pinkster azalea, Rhododendron paraclimenoides? Beautiful, beautiful plant. Fairly common depending on where you are. There's also some really fantastic, cool, and very rare azaleas in New Jersey, particularly in the southern counties. Next, please. I am a big fan of sweet fern. I love this species, Comptonia peregrina, in part because it's dioecious, right? Separate males and females. I'm really into that particular reproductive system. So you've got male plants on the right, have those like tight sort of sausage-like catkins, and then on the left, in Rachel's illustration, we have the female fruiting structure. Also has a really like interesting caterpillar fauna, a bunch of things that eat this that are pretty cool. Next. Bladderwort, love it. Great flowers, great fruits, super cool plant. Next. Gotta love the hazels. I love some hazelnuts. There's Corylus americana, the American hazelnut, but also the beaked hazelnut Corylus cornuta, Rachel's illustration there, which I really dig. Great native plants with real wildlife value. Next. I keep saying I love these things, but I do, right? Hudsonia tomentosa, beach heather, great plant, coastal plain, but also kind of gets into some really neat spots. This is a sort of a sandy bald in the middle of the pine barrens where they can pop up sometimes as well. Next. Durka palustris, the leatherwood, another great one. You see the recent iNaturalist observations of that in the state of New Jersey. When you run into this thing in the forest, that picture on the right, it took from 8 feet away. You barely see this thing on the landscape. If you're creeping around in April, you may run into it, but when you get up close to it, you realize just how beautiful those little flowers are. This is one of my favorite native plants. I'm always out there looking for it. I hope you run into it this spring, and I think you'll understand how understated but incredibly beautiful this thing is. Next. And soon we're going to see Epigenia repens, right? The trailing arbutus is one of our early spring flowering shrubs. I saw posts today from people in the southeast and showing them already in bud and about to start blooming. And so we're not too far from that either. Jury's out on kind of what is involved in pollination and also seed dispersal of this thing. I've seen bees on the flowers, but there's some talk about, hypothesis that ants are heavily involved in both pollination and the dispersal of seeds, much like the next species. Next, please. By far one of my favorites. This is broom crowberry, Carima conradii, also the subject of the very first paper I ever published back in 2005. Those of you that are lucky enough to have seen this and be out on the landscape with it know how special it is. These are photos from Warren Grove area, sort of just west on Route 70, off of Route 72 of Long Beach Island. Um, great species. Also, really cool ant plant interaction going on here. This is one of those fruits that has a little attachment on it, protein rich attachment called an elaiosome. So, what you see here is the open, there's a little hole there, right? You see there's a pencil for scale. That little hole in the ground is the ant colony, the nest, right? And what they have done is they have taken the fruits to the edge of the nest, pulled off the protein pack, and then discarded the fruit. So they're moving fruits and seeds around, right? Sometimes perhaps even bringing them underground, but mostly just getting rid of them and eating the little bit of protein that's stuck on the berry, which is super neat. Cool plant. Next. And yeah, I'm a sucker for things that aren't quite as uncommon or rare either. I really do love some sumacs, particularly the smooth sumac rus glabra. I just love that loosey-goosey in cluster of fruits. And I love winged sumac rus capelinum. So shiny, nice little flowers, and then incredible fall color. And of course, any one of these three you could use to make true pink lemonade for that little bit of vitamin C kind of sour bit. In your yellow lemonade. That's the only reason there's such a thing as pink lemonade is that you put sumac fruits in it. Next, please. And then I'll just say that, like, I also really love this sumac, and this is Rus aromatica, fragrant sumac. This is becoming really common all of a sudden in cultivation, available as a ground cover and thing, again, like bank stabilization, like that chokeberry before. I'm seeing this for sale all over the place, and it's such a great native plant, but also it's not native in New Jersey. So if you're sort of really a stickler, right? This is one that you can't plant, but I love it so much, right? Huff in the '83 book, it says not historically native in the state, but and doesn't even show up in herbarium records until the early '60s. But this is such a great species out here in Central PA. I'm really lucky I get to call it native because it grows on the limestone ridges that are within 10 minutes of our house. So the picture on the right is our little patch of fragrant sumac and just that incredible fall color that it gets. Next, please. So, when I finished the shrub guide, when we finished the shrub guide and published it, and I finished my master's, I decided I was going to go ahead and go get a PhD and become a professor of botany. And I went up to University of Connecticut, and for just a moment, I thought I was going to stop working on shrubs. I went there wanting to work on Osage orange, Maclora pomifera. If you know that species, you know that those monkey brain fruits fall under these trees. They lay there. Nobody eats them. It's a great example of what we call an anachronistic fruits that probably used to be dispersed by some kind of animal that is now extinct. So they're kind of lost in time. They're an anachronism. I was going to learn all about this, figure all this out. Within a year of my PhD, I found out someone else at another university was already doing this project. And I thought, well, that's it. I'm quitting my PhD. I'm going to go do something else. But my advisor at the time, Greg Anderson, handed me a paper about a group of plants called bush tomatoes in Australia. And he said, why don't you read this over the weekend, see what you think? And when I came back on Monday, I was convinced that's what I was going to work on. Next. So I did, right? I ended up doing my dissertation on this group of plants called bush tomatoes. These are shrubs in the genus Solanum. There's about 45 species. They live across northern Australia and the Australian monsoon tropics, and they're like an ongoing radiation. There's lots of new species even today still happening in response to long range climate oscillations that have been going on for millions of years. These are actually absolutely beautiful plants. Next. Beautiful flowers, beautiful fruits, lots of prickles, and they're shrubs, right? Unlike the solanums that we have in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, these are long-lived woody plants, right? 2 feet to maybe even 8 or 10 feet tall, living for years and years. The closest thing we have that's a relative to these in New Jersey is Solanum carolinense, the horse nettle. It's a pretty close relative, even gets a little bit kind of woody, but does not reach the stature of these things. Just great plants, right? So I ended up working on shrubs just in a totally different place. Next. I want to tell you one story about a plant that brings us back to a point I want to make at the end here. And that's that this past summer, I went over to Australia. I've been lucky to go a number of times. And one of the things I do when I go there before I get out into the outback to do field work is I'll stop at herbarium collections, places where there are thousands of pressed plant specimens. And I like to see kind of what other botanists have collected over the last few years, but also look at historical stuff. And I kept running into these bush tomatoes, these solanums from a particular part of the of Central Australia called the Tanami Desert. And every time I found specimens from that one place, I would see these little dots on the backs of the leaves. Next. And so I thought, what are these things, right? And I had a hypothesis that they were these things called extrafloral nectaries, right? That means that these are little organs that are producing nectar, but they're not in the flower. And often these are things that are present to attract ants. And when you attract ants, they then keep other animals from bothering the plant and plant collectors perhaps from bothering the plant, right? So I had this whole thing set up in my brain that maybe that's what these were. And so one of the beauties of having these museums of pressed plant collections is that there's all that information about where this was collected. And I went and drove to it, right? So I went to the northern Tanami Desert. Next. And when I got there, we found lots of plants. And not only did they have the dots on the backs of the leaves, but those dots were exuding this sticky, sweet to the taste liquid. And then lo and behold, just hit next one time, please, Mike. There were the ants all over the plants, harvesting this nectar and getting aggressive when I would try to touch the plants or make a specimen out of it. So just such a neat thing to connect like these museum specimens, these collections to this like really cool shrub there in the outback. Next. So in this situation, right, we've got these shrubs that are a super important part of the plant community. You can see this is a photo of that habitat. Tree cover is sparse. The shrub community kind of makes up a big chunk of the plant diversity in this place and are really important, right? So that's one sort of point I want to make. But the other is that, I don't think you necessarily have to go all the way to Australia to make these sorts of discoveries, right? There's all sorts of biodiversity that kind of needs to still be explained here, right? Even in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey. Next. And it reminds me a bit of some of the probably the most important group of shrubs in New Jersey, right? The heaths, the things in the Ericaceae family, Vaccinium, Gay-Lussatia, Lyonia, some of these other things. Really important, right? If you walk into any intact woodland over much of the state, the dominant family of understory plants are going to be things from this family, right? Including things like black huckleberry on the right. And my favorite vaccinium of them all, even though the fruits are not that delicious, the flowers are bonkers. That's deerberry in the middle, Vaccinium stimidium. I just love that one. But the species I want to mention as we end this talk is next. Next, please, Mike. And that's this one, right? So this is high bush blueberry, right? High bush blueberry, when I learned it, every high bush blueberry you saw, it was Vaccinium corymbosum, right? And as I've taught it over the years too, I just say, well, if you see a high bush blueberry, just call it Vaccinium corymbosum. And a lot of folks sort of are of that philosophy, but other folks have, concluded that this is more than one species. There's actually quite a few. Next. So Demony Jolman, who I mentioned at the very beginning, who's going to be a postdoc in my lab starting in June, has been looking at high bush blueberries in Virginia and that region. And I talked to her about the things that were likely to be in Jersey. And then I kind of checked that against Alan Weekly's Flora of the Southeast guide. Even though lots of us are calling all high bush blueberries Vaccinium corymbosum, there's at least three other species that also probably occur in New Jersey. There's Caesariense, the New Jersey blueberry, Formosum, the southern high bush blueberry, and there's Fuscatum, the black high bush blueberry. These are all distinguishable as separate species and all occurring in the wildlands of New Jersey. And there's a hybrid that is really underreported, but probably all over the place called Vaccinium X Marianum. That is a combination of Formosum and Fuscatum. Devaney tells me that she sees all five of these things kind of all over the place and suspects that they're all over New Jersey as well. So here we are right in our own backyard, right? A really poorly understood set of species that are similar to one another that just need work, right? So there's so much work to be done, even on our own shrub biodiversity right here in our own backyards. Next. So one of the ways we could tackle this, right, and one of the things I do in my lab is we do population genetics, right? We try to use genetics to sort of deal with difficult groups or to assess the status of rare plants. How much trouble is a rare plant in, right? Perhaps it's inbred, perhaps it's got really low diversity. So we can sort of use these kind of tools to assess those sort of things. And we have 7 species we've either already published on or are currently working on in my lab, including 2 shrubs. The box huckleberry you see there, Galisacea brachycera, pretty famous plant, and then Pexistema Canby's mountain lover. Neither of those currently occurring in New Jersey, but we do some shrub work, right? And so, sure, we could do genetics on these things. We could try to use genes to tell us, how to identify these things or how to tell us which species are which, right? But next, I will still say that there is no substitute for getting folks outside and looking around at real things in real places, right? Whether somebody thinks they're a professional botanist or not, right? Getting out there in the field and looking around is the best contribution you can make. Right? If we want to know what's out there, right? Where are the special plants? Where are the special habitats? Where are the special natural communities? There really is still no substitute to going out there with a guide in your pocket or a bunch of books in your backpack, even though we have all the apps and everything now. iNaturalist I've talked about a bunch of times today, right? I still think there's nothing like actually getting out there. This is the kind of stuff I'm trying to teach all the time and get students to understand how important it is to actually get out there in nature and understand what's around you. Many of you on this Zoom, I'm sure, know that feeling of being out there and feeling truly connected to the world around you, and that's what we have to keep encouraging people to want to feel, right? Next, please. And I think if we really want to conserve habitats, we want to conserve cool plants and all the other things that they support, it's us, right? That is going to do that. I think it's plant people for the win, right? If anybody's going to do this, help us still understand why biodiversity is important, why habitat conservation is important. I think nobody's more suited to it than those of us who love plants. And if you want to hear me say more about that, you could attend the Botany 2026 conference in Tucson this summer, where I will be giving the incoming president talk for the Botanical Society of America and talking about that very thing, right? That botanists are the ones that are going to sustain our most important communities, both natural and human. So that's what I've got. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to put up the next slide, in case anybody is interested in how to get either the tree or shrub guide, the ordering process is still in the Stone Age. You cannot order online with a credit card, but you can download go back one more, please, Mike. You can download the form, write all the information in it, and then you can write and send a check. For the young people on the call, checks are pieces of paper issued by a bank where you write an amount and then somebody gets money from that amount. But thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. And I'll take any questions if you got them. This was in case you kind of, Mike, you showed my last slide. This was in case somebody said, what was the half point you missed in dendrology when you were
Yeah.
a graduate? And it was, I spelt it with a C instead of a Q, and I got a half point off.
Oh, gee.
Yeah.
Well, we have a botanical Latin class coming up shortly.
Well, nobody will get that. That's the Virginia creeper. Nobody should get that one wrong from, I certainly have never gotten it wrong since. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Let me stop sharing and let's take a look at the questions. We have quite a few here. Um, Someone asks, if you remove allelopathic shrubs, how long does it take for the soil to get free of the?
Yeah. So allelopathy, for folks that may not know, is essentially when it's really a chemical defense that plants have. They sort of are releasing these chemicals into the soil to cut down on competition from things that aren't the same species. In general, I think that those things will sort of leach out. They're typically really water soluble. So once the sources are gone, it probably only takes a few years. But there may be somebody else that knows a lot more about that than I do. But as long as the leaf litter is gone and the actual thing is gone, it shouldn't be too long. Um,
And on that theme, I believe someone asked, like, what's a good shrub under black walnut?
That's so funny. That's very related. There's not a lot you can put under black walnut, right? Most of the time, it's one of the most infamous allelopathic trees. Um, I don't know that I could recommend anything, honestly. Most of the time when I see it, there's very little under it. Yeah.
Hmm. Please clarify Japanese knotweed scientific name. Was informed to change from Polygonum
Yep.
cuspidatum
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
Renotria japonica, but you
Yep.
listed something else.
Yeah, in that paper, I think I think we used Fallopian japonica in that paper. There's also Renutria japonica. There's also obviously Polygonum cuspidatum, as you mentioned. That taxonomy keeps shifting around, right? Every time somebody uses a different sort of part of the DNA to sort of make an evolutionary tree,
Hmm.
it gets bopped around. I usually will ask somebody who works in that group and say, "What are you using?" And then I'll use that, right? But I think among the botanical community, we're all aware that all three names are the same species. It's one of the more problematic
Hmm.
Latin names right now.
I'm a big orchid fan and orchid grower,
Mm.
and that they constantly move the orchids around,
Hmm.
change their
Yeah,
names.
yeah,
It's a botany thing, I guess.
yeah.
Um, you mentioned the Cornus drumondii
Hmm.
that you got inadvertently. Did you
Yeah,
notice whether it was more or less beneficial to the insects or?
that's a great question. Don't I have not noticed a lot of insect. I know birds are in it, and birds are eating the fruits and moving them around. I know that it has spread pretty quickly within the patch where it was planted, but probably by roots, but also I imagine it's probably getting spread by birds as well. But no, that's a great question, and that's now that I know exactly what it is and where that patch is, I probably should go check it out.
So I guess the question of companion plantings. Someone says, "What's the best shrubs for a tulip poplar?"
Hmm,
I mean,
boy.
does it really matter?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think about where I see tulip poplars, right? I mean, you get into the sort of these really interesting, like cool, steep glens where that often is, and there's some neat stuff you'll see on those same kind of like cool mountain glen slopes. Some of the places where I've seen really big tulip poplars, I've seen really great native rhododendrons, for instance. And a few other things. Sambucus, the elderberry. Depending on where you are, that red elderberry is a neat one. That's typically a little more northern, a little more in the mountains. That I sometimes see with it. But um, yeah, I don't know that you could go too wrong with just about anything with a tulip poplar.
Mm. I mean, I would imagine you could, if you use like Jersey yards, where you go and say like, well, I got this kind of soil, it's wet or dry,
Hmm.
whatever, and you just pick shrubs and trees that are the same, except that the shrub should be in the shade of the tree, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 They'll create some pretty dense shade, right? So there needs to be something shade tolerant.
How far away from a mature tree do I plant shrubs? I mean,
Hmm.
go by Miyawaki forest theory, just plant everything dense, right?
Yeah, yeah. That's I mean, and that it comes down to sort of which species we're talking about, right? Some shrubs really don't mind being in an understory and really well shaded, right? So they can be pretty close, but others are appreciate an edge or something that's a little more sunny. So they would not want to be directly under the canopy of most trees.
My nine bark has a fungus. Should I treat it or let nature resolve it? Well,
That's a tough question, but that is another native plant that I did not mention, Physocarpus opulifolius. That's a great native plant as well. And there's a lot of cultivars, right? It'd be interesting to know whether that what they've got is a cultivar that's susceptible to something
that's a
like
good
it's,
question.
or maybe it's wild type, right? But I don't know. But for me, right, I'm sometimes a high throughput um, landscaper. If something is causing enough of a problem that I have to constantly treat it, it doesn't last very long.
Yeah, there's
I'll
plenty of other
replace it
things
with some,
to
right. There's
plenty
tons
of
of
other
other
things to
things.
replace it with, right?
Right.
Yeah, I want to say like I'm a big shrub fan myself.
Mhm.
I probably have like a dozen different species.
Yeah.
My little quarter acre viburnums and chokeberries. I have the Rusa aromatica. I
Hmm.
put in a spice bush,
Yeah. Awesome.
a lot of stuff. And I just get a kick out of, all the different berries
Uh-huh.
that they generate and create.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
yeah, and the inkberries and the
Yep.
winterberry holly. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure the birds get a kick out of it too. Hmm.
Yeah, people when I have garden tour at my place, people are like, "Oh man, you have a lot of birds." It's like it's because I got trees and shrubs, and
Right.
there's a lot of food for them here to eat.
Yeah.
I have
Yep.
bird baths. It's
Yep.
like,
Yep.
oh God, let's see. Uh, you sometimes wish forest canopies were more open to allow shrubs to be more productive.
Hmm.
Well,
Yeah, again, it sort of depends on the place, right? I mean,
yeah,
some places are naturally more open, right? And but there are also shrubs that don't mind a little bit of shade, right? So I think that, there are certainly a lot of fire adapted forests, right? You think about Jersey, a lot of coastal plain, pine barren stuff, right? Where those shrubs do appreciate, right, the occasional disturbance, right? These sort of low
yeah,
intensity fires. And so yeah, I mean, I think that in those sorts of situations, that particular flora does pretty well when there are disturbances and openings in the canopy. But that idea of nature taking its course, right? Eventually, a tree will fall down, a gap will be created, and somebody's going to grow there, right? So,
your favorite low light understory shrub that will enjoy West Central Jersey.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, but I mean,
Yeah.
what's your soil? What's your
Yeah, there's a lot of things, right? I mean,
moisture?
you know, I for me, there are some cool options in that Heath family, right? So the low bush blueberries and the huckleberries and a few other things that are going to sort of do really well in that kind of situation are to me pretty decent options, right? But gosh, I may have to think about that one a little bit more.
Yeah, where I live, we have the this dense marl clay soil and a great mug, by the way.
Yeah.
And I've tried like planting some things like the mountain laurel or
Hmm.
bluebirds, things like that, and they
Yeah.
just don't do well.
Do not like it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not
Uh,
sandy acidic soil. They don't like it.
yeah. Yeah. We have a lot of clay at our house too. We can grow most things in that Heath family, right? Don't do okay here. So
Question I have is how well cornice and viburnum shrubs take heavy pruning running out of room.
yeah, pretty well. I mean, cornice in particular, right? I mean, if you look up cornice pruning, their recommendation, particularly on all those shrubs, is to cut them almost, down to like 6 inches every year to
Oh,
encourage
wow.
new growth, and then you get lots of a big flush of that, like red or
Yeah.
yellow, or depending on the cultivar and the species. So we're coming up on that point. I have the ones in my yard that I'll be cutting back pretty hard soon, encouraging a big flush of growth. So those are the sorts of things that the cornice can get really big, right, and fill up a space, but they take really well to pruning. And I think viburnums are pretty similar. That's another one where a lot of folks will cut their, every couple of years will cut their all their older, larger stems out and then encourage a flush of the younger ones that are there. So if you have younger, smaller stems, you can get out those older stems and you'll sort of maintain that
Yeah.
shrub too. So both of those genera do pretty well with hard pruning.
I'd have to say my favorite is the black haw viburnum. And
Yeah.
it turned out I had one in my yard, it was on its own there,
Hmm.
and it's the first thing to bloom
Yeah.
of the viburnums, and it's
Uh,
just gorgeous. The
yeah.
it's just completely white cover, and
Mhm.
then you get nice fruits, and the thing is suckering up.
Oh, okay.
After I started letting my yard become a homegrown national park,
Hmm.
and letting things grow and see what they were before I chopped them down. And yeah, it's just making this huge little mini
Yeah,
forest of black viburnum that keeps spreading, and it's awesome. You know,
that's cool. I like that plant a
birds
lot.
love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess we finish on this. Where can I find references on the importance of shrubs and why people should include them in their landscapes? I feel like more attention is given to trees and flowers. Well,
Hmm.
I think
Yeah.
that's what we're talking about today, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, honestly, there's not a ton, right? I think that was sort of the thing that I recognized when I had students asking the same question, right? What are the good books we can use for this, right? And so, there are a lot of books that sort of say woody plants or trees and shrubs combined, right? And so finding something like that from a landscape
Mm.
perspective, Michael Durr's Manual of Woody Landscape Plants is still a shining star when it comes to both trees and shrubs. So it's a great resource for understanding uh, the options are. And right. And so you can always go to that. It's Mike Durr, Dirr. That manual is outstanding.
Okay.
Mm.
Yeah, because you see a lot of talk about, making your yard a prairie or
Mhm. Mhm.
a meadow, all different kind of rain gardens and pollinator patches and um, but you need that shrub layer. Like I say,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
birds roost in it.
Mhm.
I have some shrubs in the back that right now there's no leaves on them, but still there's 100 of these sparrows in there
Yeah.
twittering away
Yeah.
during the day. That's where they chill out,
Yeah.
and then things like the juniper, right?
Hmm.
The eastern red cedar,
Yep.
which is really a juniper,
Hmm.
like evergreen shrubs
Yeah.
like that
Yep.
just really great for the birds in the winter. And there's all kind of berries and food sources. It's
Yep. Yep.
Shrubs are cool.
They are, right? And it's such a really great and easy way to increase the plant biodiversity of anywhere, right? There's so many options, so many species, and so many native things available in cultivation, right? So
Mm.
lots you can plant.
Hey, well, Chris, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation,
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Thanks,
and
everyone. Appreciate y'all being here.
we'll also make sure we'll put out links to where people can order their shrub and tree guides
Yeah.
because
Okay.
I know I don't have the latest editions myself. So,
Thanks so much.
okay, take care, all. Good
All
night,
right.
all.
Have a great evening. See ya.